She had been told with considerable thoroughness that no one was coming. Not the vague, weary sort of pessimism you might hear from a vicar on a particularly trying Wednesday, but something specific, calendared, and delivered with the precision of a well-oiled postal service. Every Sunday after church in the small parlour of the house on Mill Lane in Ashbrook Crossing, Somersetshire, her Aunt Agatha would set down her gloves and declare it, "Nobody is coming for you, Hester." It had been 31 consecutive Sundays since the last interruption to this routine, when Aunt Agatha had caught a chill and spent the day in bed, leaving Hester to plant sweet peas along the garden wall in a silence so profound she could actually hear herself think. Before that, the ritual had run uninterrupted for 4 years. Before that, a mercy period while Agatha visited her cousin in Shropshire. And before all of it, the early years. The years of Hester's raw grief and her aunt's formidable, relentless and oddly particular concern. Nobody is coming for you. She had heard it so many times that it had settled into her the way damp settles into an old house, not with a sudden crash, but thoroughly, insidiously, and in a way that was very difficult to address without rebuilding something fundamental. The Duke of Cheswick knocked at the door on a Tuesday in October. The house on Mill Lane was not without its charms, though one had to look for them. Hester had catalogued them over the years with the diligence of someone who needed to find things worth noticing. The kitchen garden, which she had expanded by 2 rows of herbs without bothering to ask permission. The view from the upstairs window, which caught the autumn light perfectly on certain mornings. A brief wash of amber across the stone wall before it vanished. The low stone wall itself, which she had repaired in her 3rd year using a method from one of her father's books, and which had held through 3 winters since without a single complaint. The kitchen always smelled of damp wool, dried lavender, and whatever Mrs. Peel was managing for dinner, a reliable scent like the best comforts, one you stopped noticing until the day you did, and then realized it was precisely what comfort felt like. The books, 6 crates of them, were the only things she had brought from her parents' house when it was sold to settle her father's debts. Aunt Agatha had looked at the crates with the expression of a woman discovering that the tenant she had agreed to take in also came with, well, furniture. She had been 15 when they arrived, Hester and the books. She was 25 now. 10 years was long enough to know a place thoroughly, intimately. She knew which floorboard on the upper landing announced your arrival before you even reached the turn. She knew the parlour fireplace drew beautifully when the wind was from the west and sulked with a smoky resentment when it wasn't. She knew Aunt Agatha took her tea at 8:20 precisely, and that the spoon had to be removed from the cup before she picked it up, and that there was a small framed silhouette on the mantelpiece of a man Agatha never mentioned, which Hester had decided long ago not to ask about, because some silhouettes are better left undisturbed. Aunt Agatha, Mrs. Agatha Pembridge, née Holloway, widow of a Mr. Pembridge who had been respectable enough in life and considerably less interesting in death, was not a cruel woman. Hester had decided this some years ago after careful thought, and had not revised the conclusion. She was precise, cautious, and had assembled a worldview constructed almost entirely of disappointments, in the way that people sometimes build a house from whatever materials are available, and then, with a shrug, call it architecture. She kept the house on Mill Lane in excellent order. She made excellent soup, which Hester had always thought was a reliable measure of character, not genius, but care. She attended church with commendable regularity, and was never unkind to the servants, which in Ashbrook Crossing in 1815 consisted of Mrs. Peel, the housekeeper cook, and a girl called Agnes, who came on Thursdays to do the floors, and who found Aunt Agatha terrifying. Though Agatha was neither aware of this, nor would she have found it distressing. She also kept a cat named Alderman Finch. Alderman Finch was a tortoiseshell of middle years and absolute authority. He had arrived on the parlour windowsill one November morning 7 years ago, and quite simply declined to leave. Agatha had initially taken this as an imposition, and then with time accepted it as a peculiar sort of fate. She had named him after Alderman Silas Finch of the Ashbrook Crossing Parish Council, who had ruled against her claim to a disputed strip of garden following Mr. Pembridge's death. The logic, which she had explained once and only once, was this: if that man gets to make judgments all day from a comfortable chair and everybody else is expected to accept them, then so does this one. Alderman Finch had consequently spent 7 years on the best chair in the parlour, delivering silent verdicts on visitors, pigeons, the quality of the morning light, and the acceptability of whatever was being served at meals. He had definite views about drafts. He had strong views about the hour at which the fire should be lit. He had delivered a particularly clear ruling on the butcher's boy in 1812, from which the poor lad had never entirely recovered. His standards were exacting, and his rulings were, as far as he was concerned, final. On the last Sunday of September, Aunt Agatha set down her church gloves on the hall table, removed her pelisse with the careful precision of someone who intended to wear it again next week in the same immaculate condition, and delivered the ritual with her usual unwavering certainty. "Nobody is coming for you, Hester." Hester, who was removing her bonnet and had heard this approximately 300 times, said, "Yes, Aunt Agatha." She said it in the tone of a woman confirming that rain was expected on Thursday. This was not resignation exactly. It was a particular kind of peace that comes from accepting a fact that cannot be argued with, and then simply getting on with the sweet peas. She had planted sweet peas along the garden wall in June. They were finished now, brown and papery, and satisfied with themselves, and she would pull them in November and plan next year's in January, because that was how you managed a garden. Not by grieving the end of things, but by understanding it as part of the cycle that produced them in the first place. She had learned this from her father, who had learned it from the land. The Duke arrived at 10:30, which was, in Ashbrook Crossing, the most suspicious possible hour for a caller. Too late to be delivering anything truly necessary, too early for a social call, and accompanied by a solicitor, which suggested that whatever he wanted was complicated enough to require a witness, and probably a good deal of paperwork. Hester was in the kitchen garden when Mrs. Peel appeared at the gate, wearing the expression she reserved for moments when something utterly unprecedented had happened, but she hadn't yet decided how alarmed she ought to be about it. "There is a carriage on Mill Lane," Mrs. Peel said, her voice a careful whisper, "very large, with a crest." "What kind of crest?" "The kind that has a lot of things on it," said Mrs. Peel, who held very firm views on heraldry. A man got out, then another man. The first man knocked at the front door. Hester looked at her hands, which were muddy to the wrist. She looked at Mrs. Peel, who was already holding a clean cloth with the foresight of someone who had managed this household for 20 years and seen everything. Hester cleaned her hands, removed her garden apron, and went to the front door. The man who had knocked was perhaps 35, tall in the way that some men are tall, not immediately noticeable until you found yourself looking up rather more than expected, and that the doorframe appeared to be doing more work than usual. He had dark hair worn without excessive attention to fashion, and the kind of face that had, over time, arranged itself into an expression of measured composure, as though his original temperament had been more turbulent, and this was the carefully constructed public version. His jaw was slightly too decided for conventional handsomeness, which made him, Hester thought, more interesting than merely handsome. His eyes were an unusual colour, not blue, not green, but the particular moss green of something growing in deep shade, quiet, quite unexpected, and a shade she suspected she would be thinking about later, whether she wished to or not. He wore a coat that had been made by someone who truly understood their trade. He held his hat in both hands, which she noticed because most men held a hat in one hand and used the other for something, an accessory, a gesture, a means of taking up more space. He was holding it in both, which suggested he had arrived uncertain of his reception and was prepared to be patient. Beside him, a step behind, stood an older man of approximately 55 with a leather satchel, which Hester recognized immediately as the kind carried by solicitors, the satchel of a man who had brought documentation and fully expected to use it. The Duke looked at Hester with the politely inquiring expression of someone who had knocked at a door expecting a butler and received something else entirely, something rather more interesting. "Good morning," he said. "I am looking for Mr. Robert Whitmore. I was told he resided at this address." Hester considered him for a moment. He was very collected. She suspected it cost him something to maintain that level of composure. "My father has been dead 7 years," she said, her voice even without inflection. He was quiet for a moment. Not an empty quiet, but the kind that is very full of something being quickly reconsidered, a sudden recalibration of his internal compass. "I see," he said. "I apologize, I was not aware. I am Barnaby Norwood, the Duke of Cheswick. "This is my man of business, Mr. Griggs." Griggs inclined his head. He had the air of a man who had been in this sort of situation before, not this specific situation perhaps, but certainly situations of comparable awkwardness, and who had decided that the correct response was silence and careful note-taking, preferably with a very efficient pen. Hester stepped back from the doorway. "Under the circumstances," she said, "you had better come in." Aunt Agatha was in the parlour. She had in fact been in the parlour since the moment Mrs. Peel had mentioned the crest, occupying her chair beside the window, with the posture of someone who was absolutely definitively not watching the front drive. Alderman Finch was on the windowsill beside her, watching with rather more openness, his gaze moving from the door to the new arrivals, with the professional attention of a seasoned man reviewing credentials. Hester brought the Duke and Mr. Griggs into the parlour and introduced everyone with the brisk competence of someone who had managed larger complications than this with considerably fewer resources. Barnaby Norwood bowed to Agatha, which Agatha received with the expression of a woman storing every scrap of information for later assessment. Mr. Griggs sat in the chair nearest the window and opened his satchel with the quiet efficiency of a man getting straight to work. Alderman Finch examined the Duke for approximately 4 seconds and then looked away, which in Finch terms could mean almost anything from mild disinterest to profound philosophical contemplation. The matter, as Barnaby explained it, was this. His uncle, Gerald Norwood, had been the previous Duke of Cheswick. Gerald had died 3 years ago, and the dukedom had passed to Barnaby, his nephew. In settling the estate, Barnaby had found, among various papers and effects, a letter, not a legal document, mind you, nothing filed, nothing witnessed. A private letter written in Gerald's own hand, addressed to no one in particular, dated 8 years ago. The letter concerned a man named Robert Whitmore, who had served as land steward at Chzwick Park for 9 years. Hester had been very still while he said all of this. The name, her father's name, from a duke she had never met, in a letter that had apparently existed for 8 years without her knowledge, had the particular quality of a stone dropped into perfectly still water. The ripples moved outward before you could stop them, disturbing everything. "My father left Chzwick Park when I was 12, she said. There had been some disagreement about land." "Yes," Barnaby said, "that is precisely what the letter addresses." He said this with the restraint of someone who knew the rest of the sentence was considerably more complicated. Griggs produced a document from the satchel, not the letter itself, but what appeared to be a careful copy, and set it on the table between them with the practiced neutrality of a man who knew his job was to facilitate, not interpret, and certainly not to offer opinions. Agatha, who had been entirely silent until this point, in the manner of a woman carefully collecting evidence, said, "What exactly does the letter say?" Barnaby looked at Agatha. She held his gaze in the particular way of someone who had lived long enough to be utterly unimpressed by dukes and intended to be perfectly clear about it. "It says," he said, "that my uncle believed Robert Whitmore was treated unfairly, that a parcel of land was reassigned during an estate dispute, one that Gerald had the power to resolve in Whitmore's favour, but did not act on quickly enough. The settlement came too late to prevent Whitmore from having to leave. Gerald considered this a debt, a matter of honour." Hester looked at the copy of the letter on the table. The date on it was 8 years ago. Her father had been alive then. She thought of him, quiet, precise, always with a book in hand, the sort of man who could tell you the drainage capacity of a field by walking across it twice, simply by the feel of the earth under his boots. He had never mentioned a debt owed to him by a duke. "What does the letter say should be done about it?" she said. The Duke was quiet for a moment. Honest, she thought, watching his face. He was deciding how to be honest rather than whether to be honest at all. "It says," he said, "that if Robert Whitmore's daughter should find herself in difficulty, without resources, without adequate support, the estate is to assist her. Gerald writes it as a private obligation. Not legal, not binding on me in any court. Binding, he says, in conscience, and that, it seems, was enough for him." Hester looked at the letter copy. She looked at the Duke. He could have simply thrown it away, she said. The letter, when he found it, without anyone ever knowing. "Yes," Barnaby said. "He could have. He said it without any performance of virtue, which Hester found considerably more interesting than if he had. Agatha made a sound that was not quite a word, more a thoughtful hum. Alderman Finch on the windowsill watched the Duke with the expression of a man who was beginning to revise his initial assessment, but intended to take his own sweet time about it. He left that day with nothing resolved. This was, Mr. Griggs's expression suggested, somewhat unusual. The satchel was repacked with the air of a man returning from an expedition that had not quite reached its intended destination. His mouth had the very slight compression of a man who had expected a straightforward outcome and was now quite clearly recalculating. Hester had said she would need to think. She had meant it. The Duke had accepted this with a nod that conveyed he understood it was reasonable, and possibly also that he was relieved to have been given a reason to come back, which was, she thought, watching the carriage disappear at the end of Mill Lane, an interesting thing indeed to be relieved about. He returned on the Friday. Ostensibly, Mr. Griggs had a question about the original land survey. Mr. Griggs, however, was not present. The Duke arrived alone. Well, not entirely alone. There was a groom and the carriage and an assortment of attendants who waited at the end of Mill Lane with the practiced invisibility of people, employed to be somewhere without actually being noticed, but without his solicitor, which changed the character of the visit considerably. They sat in the parlour for an hour and a half. Alderman Finch, after an initial period of pointed indifference in which he maintained his position on the windowsill and addressed no one, migrated at the 40-minute mark to his preferred chair and began his formal review of the Duke's boots from across the room. Tea was brought by Mrs. Peel with the particular thoroughness of someone who had baked that morning, without acknowledging precisely why she had baked that morning, and who had produced a plate of shortbread biscuits that was perhaps more generous than the household usually warranted, or perhaps simply hoped for. He asked about her father, what Robert Whitmore had been like, how he had managed the estate in Gloucestershire before the debts had finally caught up with them, whether Hester had learned the bookkeeping from him or on her own. On my own, she said mostly. He showed me how to read a surveyor's map, how to look at a field on paper, and truly understand what it meant in terms of soil and drainage and actual ground. The rest was trial and error, and a great deal of error. What was the error? Trying to keep the kitchen garden profitable during a bad summer, she said. I planted the wrong things, not entirely wrong, mind you, enough to eat, but not enough to sell. I recalculated in September and switched to root vegetables for the following year, and that worked better. She paused. My father would have known from the start. He knew soil the way some people know music, by instinct, and by something that was probably love, though he never called it that, preferring to speak of optimum conditions and symbiotic relationships. He was listening in the way of someone who was genuinely attending, not simply waiting for a pause to speak. She had noticed this on the first visit too. She noticed now that he did not fill silences out of discomfort. He let them finish naturally, which was the manner of a man confident enough in himself not to need the noise. It was not a common quality, and she found it more restful than she had expected. He came on the Monday the following week. Agatha watched from the hall as Hester let him in. She said nothing. This was itself remarkable. Hester had learned to read her aunt's silences the way you learn to read weather, by what they preceded. This silence was not disapproving. It was something she hadn't heard before. It was, she thought, something very like waiting, and that, in Agatha's world, was a considerable thing. That Sunday, Agatha set down her church gloves and looked at the hat stand for a long moment. "Nobody is coming for you, Hester," she said finally. There was a pause. "Although," she began. She did not finish the sentence. Hester, who had been watching her profile, did not press. Some sentences she knew were far more interesting unfinished. He brought the original letter on the fourth visit. It was a Wednesday. Hester was in the parlour with a book she was not reading, because her concentration had been increasingly unreliable since the previous Friday, and she had stopped pretending otherwise. When Mrs. Peel announced him, she set the book down and thought, well, he is certainly not running out of reasons to come. The letter was in Gerald Norwood's hand, an older man's hand, slightly unsteady at the edges, the kind of handwriting that had been formed in a different era and maintained its original character, regardless of what the wrist had become since. Hester read it slowly, carefully. It was longer than she had expected. Gerald Norwood had written about Robert Whitmore in the particular way of someone who considered themselves to owe a debt that could not be adequately expressed, a burden of conscience. He wrote about the land dispute, a parcel of meadow on the south edge of the Chzwick estate, with good drainage and a natural boundary that had been informally managed by the Whitmore family for 2 generations. When a neighbouring claim came in through Gerald's cousin by marriage, Gerald had delayed. He had delayed because it was inconvenient. He had delayed because settling it would have required confronting his cousin by marriage, whom he disliked but owed a favour. And Gerald, who was by his own account not a cowardly man in most respects, was cowardly in precisely this one. By the time he acted, Robert Whitmore had already made arrangements to leave. His pride, no doubt, stung. Gerald had written, "I resolved it correctly and too late, which is perhaps the most useless kind of resolution." Whitmore did not complain. He thanked me. I found this worse. A man who thanks you for correcting an injustice 8 years too slow is either very gracious or has simply given up expecting better, and I am not sure which is the worst thing to have made of him. Hester's hands had been very still while she read this, her breathing shallow. The last paragraph was the one Barnaby had described, about the daughter. It was brief and matter-of-fact, which made it, she found, considerably harder to read than if it had been sentimental. Gerald Norwood had written, "If Whitmore's girl is in difficulty, wants for what she ought to have, the estate will see to it. I do not know her name. I should like to think that this is because she is well settled and it has never been relevant. But if it is relevant, see to it, and do so without further delay." She set the letter down on her knee. She looked at Barnaby, who was watching her with the careful attention of someone who knew that certain moments required you to do nothing but simply be present in them. "He didn't know my name," she said, the words a quiet observation. "He didn't," Barnaby said. "He wrote this 8 years ago and never sent it. He wrote a great many things he never sent. It was a habit of his, apparently. Griggs found 17 unsent letters in various drawers. Most of them, rather predictably, were complaints about the weather." She looked at him. He met her gaze without deflection, without a trace of evasion. "Why didn't you send Griggs?" she said. "Any of these times, for that matter." "Because," he said, "Griggs has a very limited conversational range. We have discussed drainage at length, and I found I preferred this." She thought about this. "You could have written," she said. "He agreed that he could have. You chose not to. He agreed that he had." She found this more straightforwardly honest than anything a man in his position had any obligation to be. She found it. She turned the word over privately, with care as one might a rare coin. Interesting. Alderman Finch, in the corner, opened one eye and then closed it again, which, in Finch terms, constituted a moderate if grudging endorsement. On Thursday, she walked in the direction of the Chzwick Road without quite intending to, turned back at the 3rd milestone, and spent the walk back telling herself a great many sensible things about the situation, none of which she entirely believed, not really. On Friday she asked Mrs. Peel for her honest opinion. Mrs. Peel, who had been housekeeper and cook to the household for 20 years and knew more about the shape of things than she was generally given credit for, paused in the act of rolling pastry and said, "My honest opinion about what specifically, Miss Whitmore? About a man who says he has come on legal business and has now come 4 times without bringing his solicitor." Mrs. Peel considered the pastry. She pressed it once with the ball of her hand, which was the kind of response that was not quite a response, and said more than words ever would have. "He could still be on legal business," she said. "Legal business takes time, after all." Hester said nothing. Or Mrs. Peel continued in the tone of a woman who is going to say the most useful thing in the most offhand possible way, "He could be on a different kind of business that he hasn't exactly named yet." She glanced up briefly. "Though, of course, that's not for me to say." "No," Hester agreed, "it isn't." There was a pause in which both of them understood perfectly well what the other thought, and neither found it necessary to say so aloud. Hester went to the garden. She had the conversation with Barnaby on his 5th visit in the parlour, after tea and before he had quite committed to leaving. It was, she thought, the appropriate time, not confrontational, not designed to be. But she had decided that she was not the sort of person who left important questions unasked simply because they were difficult or might prove awkward. "You have been here 5 times, she said. He agreed that he had. "The letter was explained on the second visit," she said. "There is no legal complexity I am aware of remaining. Mr. Griggs has not accompanied you for the last 3 visits. He was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of a man who has been honest so far, and is deciding whether to continue being honest, or perhaps how much more honest he can afford to be. "No," he said. "Why have you continued to come?" He looked at her. The moss-green eyes held an expression she had not seen on him before, still measured, still composed, but with something unguarded underneath. Like a window, with the curtain moved an inch, allowing a glimpse inside. "I find I wanted to," he said. "I was not certain that constituted a sufficient reason in the eyes of society, at least." "Is it?" "I don't know yet," he said. "I was hoping you might have a view on the matter." She thought about the sweet peas along the garden wall. She thought about 31 consecutive Sundays, and the word "although" unfinished hanging in the hall, a whisper of possibility. "I don't know yet either," she said. "But I'm not asking you not to come." He stood with his hat in his hand in the hall for a moment, before Mrs. Peel, with impeccable timing, opened the front door. "Good afternoon, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Good afternoon," she said. "Mill Lane. The door is the blue one. You've found it 5 times now, so I assume you no longer require directions." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the definite architecture of one, and he left. That evening, Agatha did not go to bed at her usual hour. She sat in the parlour with her candle long past 9, which was itself significant. Agatha was a woman of rigorously reliable schedule, who considered sitting up late a sign of a disordered mind, and had not, in Hester's 10 years of residence, stayed past 9:15. The fire had burned down to coals. The candle was the only real light, and it made the parlour look smaller and older, more like a room in which things were about to be said that had been kept in a particular drawer for a very, very long time. Alderman Finch sat beside her with his tail wrapped around his feet, in the manner of someone providing company, without interfering with it in the slightest. He was the only creature in Agatha's life who consistently managed this. Most people either interfered or withdrew. Finch, with characteristic ingenuity, had developed a third option. Hester, coming down for a glass of water, found her aunt there and stopped in the doorway, a sudden stillness in her own step. She waited. Agatha was not a woman who could be prompted. She was a woman who would speak when she had arranged what she intended to say, and not a syllable before, and pushing her was like pushing a very old, very solid wall. Unpleasant for both parties, and productive for neither. Eventually Agatha said, "Sit down, Hester." She sat. "I was going to be married once," Agatha said. "Before Mr. Pembridge, you understand." Hester said nothing. In her experience, the correct response to this particular kind of opening was to provide very little resistance and let the current simply carry whatever it was carrying. He was a pleasant man, not extraordinary perhaps, but pleasant and reliable seeming, which I was 22 and did not yet understand, was a different thing from truly reliable. He said he would come back for me. He had to go north for a position, a good one, better than his father's living, and he said he would come back in 2 years once he was settled, and I said I would wait, and I waited. He came back, Agatha said, and her voice had the particular flatness of something said too many times in private and never quite aloud. He came back with a wife, a Northumberland girl. She was very pretty. He introduced me to her at the assembly, and she shook my hand and she did not know a thing. She stroked Alderman Finch with the absent attention of someone whose hands needed something to do, a small, repetitive action, while the rest of her managed something far more complex. Mr. Pembridge came the following year, she said. He was a decent man, not unkind, not precisely reliable. He had a quality of intention that outpaced his follow-through, which is common enough in men and occasionally even charming for the first 6 months. He died 11 years later of a complaint he had been managing quietly for 3 years without telling me, which I consider the most characteristic thing he ever did. He left me this house and a modest income, and a great deal of silence to fill. She was quiet for a moment. "I have not been," she said carefully, "unkind to you intentionally. You understand that, don't you?" Hester looked at her aunt. Agatha's profile was turned toward the window, where the October dark was complete and unreadable. She was a woman who had been pretty once, Hester thought. You could still see the architecture of it in the set of her jaw, the proud way she held her chin, and who had somewhere along the way made a decision, perhaps not entirely conscious, to put that aside as a thing that had not served her. "I understand," Hester said. She meant it. She did not say "and yet." She did not say. The effect was still the same. She thought both of those things and set them aside for a later moment, one that was not this one. What she said was, "Were you always so certain no one would come?" "I was not always certain," Agatha said. She paused, and the pause had the weight of something that had taken years, decades even, to compress into that smaller space. That, she implied, was the problem. Alderman Finch made a small sound, somewhere between a purr and a considered remark, and resettled himself against Agatha's arm with the deliberate companionship of a creature who was, fundamentally, unequivocally, on her side. The candle moved in a draught from under the door. The last coal in the grate made a small settling sound. "There is a difference," Hester said finally, "between telling me not to hope and protecting me from the particular, insidious way that hope can become a habit of loss." Agatha looked at her. Something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but reconfigured, as though Hester had said something that Agatha had not quite thought of in those terms, and had found that the terms, offered clearly and without accusation, were accurate in a way she could, perhaps, actually sit with. "He is a duke," Agatha said, "which is not a reason against in itself, but it is a great distance from Mill Lane, a very great distance." "I know," Hester said. "You do not know anything about his character beyond 5 visits, Hester." "I know that he told me why he came when he didn't have to," Hester said. "I know he brought his uncle's actual letter rather than a mere summary of it. I know that he sat in that chair 3 times without being asked to keep coming back and came back anyway, and then arrived on Thursday with nothing in his hands and said so plainly. I know that Alderman Finch has not definitively ruled against him, which is, I assure you, the most we can expect of Alderman Finch under the circumstances." Agatha looked at the cat. Alderman Finch, in the manner of a man who is being discussed and considers it only appropriate that he be consulted, looked back with the expression of someone who intends to reserve final judgment until all evidence is presented and the court is properly convened with all due ceremony. "He is very large for a parlour," Agatha said. "The Duke," said Agatha. "He fills the doorway quite considerably." "He does," Hester agreed. Agatha made a sound that was not quite disapproval and not quite its opposite, a sort of thoughtful huff. She picked up her candle and went to bed. Hester sat in the parlour with Alderman Finch for a while longer. The fire was entirely cold now, and the room had the particular quality that cold rooms have at night. Honest, slightly exposing, without the softening warmth that makes everything look warmer than it is. Outside, the wind was from the north, and the sweet peas had long since finished. But the wall was good. She had repaired it well all those years ago, with her father's book open on the ground beside her, and her hands learning what the text had described, and it would hold through winter as she would too. He came on a Thursday in late October with no satchel, no solicitor, no paper of any description, and no explanation for his presence beyond simply arriving at 10:30 and accepting the tea that Mrs. Peel brought with the expression of someone who had, quite plainly, been expecting him for 2 days. Hester looked at him when he sat down in the chair that had, over 5 visits, become identifiably his chair, the one with the good light and the slightly uneven leg, which Agatha had been meaning to have seen to for 3 years and had not, and which Hester suspected would now be left precisely as it was indefinitely, a small monument to unexpected habit. "You've run out of pretexts," she said. "I have run out of pretexts," he agreed. "I came anyway." She poured the tea. He watched her pour it with the attention of a man who was making no effort to seem less interested than he was, which she found both easier and harder than the alternative, like a puzzle she hadn't quite solved. Alderman Finch descended from his chair with the deliberation of a man who has decided to take a position. He crossed the parlour, which took him 6 stately steps, and came to a stop directly at Barnaby's knee. He examined the Duke's waistcoat with the expression of a magistrate examining documentation for potential fraud. He investigated the trouser leg. He considered, at some length, the left boot, with an air of profound, if silent, judgment. Then he stepped up onto the Duke's lap, with the unquestionable authority of someone who has reached a verdict and intends to record it for posterity. He arranged himself there with his usual precision. He looked back at Hester. He looked at the Duke. He looked back at Hester again in the manner of a man who has delivered his conclusion and considers the matter entirely settled beyond all reasonable doubt. Barnaby looked down at the cat on his lap with the expression of a man who had certainly not been prepared for this and was not certain how to interpret it, but strongly suspected it was significant. "He passed," Hester said. He looked up. "Did he, indeed? He is on your lap. He does not do that to people he has found wanting. He found Mr. Griggs wanting immediately, for example. He spends the rest of the visit staring at him from the window-sill with an air of profound disapproval. Mr. Griggs makes a noise when he reads," Barnaby said. "A sort of humming sound under his breath. Apparently so do I." He looked at her. Hester. It was the first time he had used her name without the miss in front of it. She noticed a small, quiet shift in the air between them. "I'm not good at saying things of this kind with the appropriate elegance," he said. "I should tell you that now so that you are not later disappointed by the decided lack of it." "I have no particular requirement for elegance," she said. "I have found," he said, "over these weeks, over these visits, that I think about this house considerably more than I think about Cheswick Park. I think about you considerably more than I think about most things I am supposed to be thinking about, which is several hundred acres, and a roof that needs urgent attention, and the drainage situation in the lower fields. I think about the way you said on my first visit that your father had been dead 7 years, in a voice with nothing particular in it, which made me realize that the nothing particular was very carefully placed there. I think about the garden wall and the sweet peas you mentioned and the books." He stopped. He looked down at Alderman Finch, who was kneading his knee with the measured persistence of a man finalizing paperwork, ensuring every detail was perfect. "I am a duke," he said, "which is not a reason against anything in itself, but I am aware it is a great distance from Mill Lane, a very different sort of life." She looked at him. The moss-green eyes, in the October morning light, were very direct, very clear. "I know," she said. "I am asking," he said, "whether the distance is prohibitive." She thought about this. She thought about the letter and the word "although" unfinished in the hall. She thought about her father, who had known soil by instinct and had died without anyone ever owing him what he was owed. She thought about what it meant to wait for something to arrive and what it meant to simply live, which she had largely done, and whether there was, truly, a difference. "Ask me something more specific," she said. "I'm not good at vague questions, Duke. I need to know what I'm answering." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not the composure which held firm, but something underneath it, something more particular, more vulnerable. "Would you come to Chzwick?" he said. "Would you see it? The library, I think your father would have liked it. There is a surveying collection in the East Wing that has not been properly catalogued in 15 years. And then, if you found it, if it suited you." He stopped. "Yes?" she said. He said, "I would like very much not to continue arriving at Mill Lane on pretexts, Hester. I would like to arrive here without needing one, with an honest purpose." She looked at him. He looked back, his gaze steady. Alderman Finch closed his eyes and began to purr with the measured satisfaction of a man who has delivered an accurate ruling and fully expects his judgment to be upheld, without question. She went to Cheswick Park on a clear Friday at the end of October, accompanied by Mrs. Peel, who had packed a bag of biscuits for the journey and said nothing of significance the entire way, which was, in fact, the most supportive thing she could have done. The library was very good. This was her first thought walking through the door of it, before the dimensions or the height of the ceiling or the smell of old binding that rose to meet her immediately, the particular smell of paper and time that was, in Hester's experience, one of the more reliable indicators of a library worth trusting. It was the kind of room that had been used for honest-to-goodness reading, rather than for merely looking like a room used for reading, which is a distinction far more significant than it sounds. The shelves were not ordered for appearance. Books were shelved by size in some places, and by subject in others, and in several cases apparently by some third, deeply idiosyncratic system that remained known only to the previous librarian. The chairs were placed for light, not for symmetry. There was a desk near the south window that had ink on it from considerable use, and a pen lying on its side that suggested someone had set it down in the middle of a thought and gone away and not come back for rather a long time, a quiet proof of a mind interrupted. The surveying collection in the east alcove was in fact magnificent and absolutely gloriously chaotic. It occupied 4 shelves and 2 cabinets, and a large flat drawer that, when Hester opened it, revealed 6 rolled maps of varying date and condition, stacked without any particular system. She could smell the age of them, the linen backing, the slight dampness of very old paper, the particular dryness of ink that had been set for a century. She set her hand on the edge of the drawer for a moment without touching them, a silent reverence. She spent 40 minutes with the collection before she quite realized she had been there 40 minutes, so absorbed was she. Barnaby, who had accompanied her from the door, and then quietly stopped talking when it became apparent that talking was not what was needed, sat on the windowsill and watched her with the expression of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. He had not moved. He had not filled the silence. He had simply been present in it, which she was finding with increasing frequency to be the thing she valued most about him, a quiet and steadfast presence. "There is a land survey here dated 1756, she said, without turning around, that I suspect has not been looked at since, well, 1756. "There is a great deal here that has not been looked at since its date," he agreed, with a wry note in his voice. "This should be catalogued properly. Yes, it would take weeks, perhaps months, yes. It would take." She turned around. He was watching her with the very direct quality of his moss-green eyes, and the corner of his mouth had the particular arrangement that she had started to recognize as the architecture of something he was not quite saying, but certainly thinking. "You planned this," she said. "The chaos." "I did not plan the chaos. The chaos, I assure you, preceded me. I merely noticed that you would find it interesting. That is a distinction that is doing quite a lot of work, Duke. Most useful distinctions do, Miss Whitmore." She looked at him. He looked at her. In the garden below the east window, the last of the October leaves moved in the wind, brown and gold against the grey stone of the garden wall. The light through old glass made everything warm even when the air was cold, which was perhaps what old houses were for, after all, not grandeur, but the particular quality of light through glass that had been standing long enough to develop a character all its own. "Will you look at the rest of it?" he said. "The house. Before you decide, that is." She said, "I have already decided." He was very still, a sudden, almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders. "I decided at some point during the second visit," she said, "possibly the third. I wanted to be fair about it. I did not want to decide too quickly, and then find I had decided on insufficient evidence, or on the wrong evidence, or on something I hadn't quite examined yet." She looked at the windows, at the October light coming in, "But I have now been here for 2 hours and the evidence is entirely satisfactory. The library is excellent. The surveying collection needs attention, which is precisely the kind of thing I am good at. And you," she said, meeting his eyes directly, "are the sort of man who brought his uncle's actual letter rather than a mere copy, and did not tell me it was more convenient to send Griggs, which tells me rather more than 3 seasons of society introductions would have told me about anyone, Duke." He stood up from the windowsill slowly. He was very still, in the way of someone exercising considerable, almost reverent care about the next thing they did, because the next thing mattered, more than almost anything else. "The library could use a second opinion on the organization," she said, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "It could," he agreed. She said, "Ask me properly, then." He was quiet for a moment, in the manner of a man deciding how to say something without the armor of composure, which was, she suspected, the more difficult direction for him to go. Then he said, in a voice that was considerably less measured than usual, and was, she found, all the better for it, "Hester Whitmore, I would very much like you to marry me. The cataloguing situation alone, I believe, would justify a long commitment, and I would not insult either of us by pretending otherwise. But also, And I am aware this is rather less efficient than the purely practical argument, because I have thought about very little else since a Tuesday in October when you told me my uncle's land steward was dead, and then asked me without flinching why I hadn't simply thrown the letter away. I didn't have a satisfactory answer for you then. The honest answer is that I thought someone should be honest about what was owed. And then I met you, and you were honest about everything, including the fact that you had no particular need of elegance, and I found I did not want to stop coming to Mill Lane. I am not certain I could stop even if asked to. She looked at the surveying collection. She looked at the windows, at the light through old glass. She looked at him, standing in his uncle's library with his hands at his sides, and nothing arranged on his face that was not, quite simply, true. Yes, she said, I will marry you. He exhaled. It was, she thought, a very honest exhale, the kind that comes when the thing you were holding carefully has been set down safely, and you realize you have been holding it for quite a long time, perhaps longer than you knew. They were in the library in October light with 70 years of unsorted surveys between them, and absolutely nothing yet resolved, and everything somehow exactly as it should be. It was, on reflection, a perfectly reasonable place to start. The resolution and a minor dispute about Bath. The matter of Aunt Agatha was raised by Hester a week later, on a Monday afternoon in the Mill Lane parlour, with Barnaby present and Mr. Griggs decidedly not, and Mrs. Peel within hearing distance through the kitchen wall, because Mrs. Peel had excellent hearing and absolutely no intention of missing this, not for the world. Agatha had received the news of the engagement in the manner of a woman who has been told something she suspected was coming, and is now deciding how to feel about it publicly. She had said, "He has good posture." She had said, "The house on Mill Lane will need to be arranged differently." She had said nothing else, and gone to bed at the usual hour and come down to breakfast the following morning, looking precisely as she always looked, which told Hester nothing except that Agatha was not a woman who showed her interior adjustments, not to anyone. The matter that Hester raised, the matter she had intended to raise calmly and directly, in the spirit of their recent conversations, was this. Barnaby had, at some point in the preceding week, and without telling her, written to a Mrs. Honoria Bramwell of Bath. Mrs. Honoria Bramwell was Agatha's estranged elder sister. They had not spoken for 9 years, since a dispute about an inheritance in which both sides had been wrong in different ways, which is usually the worst kind of dispute, because it precludes the comfort of a clear villain. They had, however, this Hester had not known, and Barnaby had apparently discovered through inquiries she was not aware he had made, continued to write to each other once a year. A single letter each, always in November, always formal, always ending with the rather dry information that both parties remained alive and in reasonable health. Barnaby had written to Mrs. Honoria Bramwell of Bath to inquire whether she might have a spare room in the spring for a rather particular guest. Hester had discovered this from Mrs. Peel, who had of course seen the address on the outgoing correspondence. She was, when she raised it, very precise about her objection. "You did this without asking me," she said. "I did," he agreed. He was on his chair with Alderman Finch already installed on his lap, which Hester considered gave him a decidedly unfair advantage in the conversation. "You should have asked me." "You would have said no," he said. "That is precisely why you should have asked," she said. He considered this. He was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of someone genuinely thinking, rather than merely finding an angle. "You are correct," he said. "I should have asked." Hester looked at him. He met her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. "I am sorry," he said. "Not for the letter itself, because I believe Mrs. Bramwell will say yes, and I believe Agatha will be considerably less miserable in Bath near her sister than she would be anywhere else alone. But for the method, I should have asked." She held the apology for a moment. It was a good apology, specific, without qualification, and not immediately followed by a "but." "You are forgiven," she said. "Do not do it again, Duke." "I won't," he said. Alderman Finch, on his lap, opened one eye and made a sound that was not quite approval and not quite reproach, but contained elements of both, which was, in Alderman Finch terms, an acknowledgement that the proceedings had been handled to a reasonable standard, all things considered. Agatha told of the letter and of Mrs. Bramwell's likely response, said nothing for quite a long time. The kind of silence that had a definite shape to it, that was taking up room in the parlour and pressing slightly against the walls. Alderman Finch had relocated to the arm of her chair and was watching the garden in the manner of a man reviewing his options, tail moving in slow, deliberate sweeps, a study in feline contemplation. "The woman is extremely difficult," Agatha said. "I'm aware," Hester said. "She talks about her rose garden as though no one else in England has ever grown a rose, as though roses are a personal discovery she made and has been gracious enough to share with the rest of the country." "So I understand," said Hester, a small smile playing on her lips. "She once told me my quince jelly was too firm," Agatha said, "in 1806. I still think about it, you know. You have excellent quince jelly." "I know," said Agatha. "That is precisely the point." Agatha was quiet again. She stroked Alderman Finch with the deliberate attention of someone doing something with their hands so as not to betray what their face was doing. "He will need to come," she said. "Finch, that is." "Of course," said Barnaby. "We expected nothing less." Alderman Finch's ear rotated 1 degree in the measured way of a man who has made his requirements known and considers the meeting quite definitively adjourned. The outro, a letter, composed in November. "Dear Mamma, I am to be a duchess, which I suspect would have made you laugh until you cried and then immediately begin planning your hat for the wedding. I want you to know that I thought of you throughout, which is less maudlin than it sounds, because I mostly thought of the specific expression on your face you always made when something went far better than expected. That very small, very private smile that you kept for occasions where you were right but didn't want to say so. You were right about a great many things. I intend to catalogue them as time permits. The Duke is Barnaby Norwood, which is not a name that announces itself dramatically, which I consider very much in his favour. He is direct. He reads. He has moss-green eyes that do considerable work when he is not saying the thing he's actually thinking, and he found a letter his dead uncle had written about Papa and brought it personally rather than sending his solicitor, which I suspect tells you more about him than any number of social introductions ever would. He also now has a large cat on his lap most afternoons, which was certainly not in his original plans for the dukedom, but which he has accepted with what I consider appropriate equanimity. Aunt Agatha is going to Bath. I know what you are thinking. I thought it too. But she is going to her sister Honoria, which I believe is what she has wanted for 9 years and could not bring herself to ask for, and I suspect they will be furious at each other on a daily basis and both be considerably better off for it. The library at Chzwick is extraordinary. Papa would have spent a week in the surveying alcove alone, I am quite certain. I find I have no further objections to any of it. Apparently, Mama, someone was coming after all. He just took the scenic route and arrived on a Tuesday and asked for Papa first, which is the sort of thing that would have made you say, well, that's very like life, isn't it? It is very like life. All my love, as ever, Hester. Stories told with quiet love.
I used to walk through empty rooms with my heart locked up in dust and gloom. The world was quiet, but it never felt kind. I was just surviving, killing time. Then you came in like morning rain, soft on the roof, washing out the pain. You didn't ask me to be anything, just stood there close and let me sing. And I was scared to hold the moment, scared that love could slip away. But you looked at me like somehow I was worth the risk to stay. Don't let go of this fragile life. It's the first thing that's felt alive. In a house of shadows you made it bright. Darling, stay. Don't let it burn. Found the parts I tried to hide, the broken edges, the quiet nights, and you'd never call them by their names. You just held me through them anyway. You turned my silence into sound, like roots reaching under frozen ground. And I, who never knew how to trust, started believing in us. Still I feel the weight of forever, every promise on my skin. How can something beautiful be so fragile from within? Don't let go of this fragile life. It's the first thing that's felt alive. In a house of shadows, you made it bright. Now I'm afraid of the dark again, afraid of losing what I found. If love is a fire, then darling, stay. Don't let it burn out. If I tremble, if I break, if the night comes too late, would you still find me here? Or would you still stay near? 'Cause I've spent my whole life learning how to say goodbye, but you taught my heart how to begin again. Don't let go of this fragile life. It's the only thing that feels like life. In a world that begs you, make it right. So if the storm comes, hold me close. If I'm lost, be my way home. I've never loved like this before, and I don't wanna let it go. No, I don't wanna let it go. This fragile life, this beautiful soul.
Disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction. The characters, places, events, and conversation are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, living or deceased, or actual events, is purely coincidental. This story is created for entertainment purposes only.